Well, concerning the relations between China and the United States, allow me to elaborate on a few additional points. Ultimately, when focusing on the Taiwan issue up until the present day, our central government has not announced any specific timetable. There's never been an announcement, right? Announcing it and not achieving it would be passive, so it hasn't been done. Plus, as of today, based on President Xi's speeches, the focus remains on peaceful reunification. Even on several occasions in public, right, I strive for peaceful reunification with the utmost patience, sincerity, and effort. Here's what we're seeing now. Our central government hasn't announced a timetable and has said this repeatedly. Strive for a peaceful reunification, correct? Nevertheless, at present, numerous Americans are forecasting that we possess a significant probability. 2027 resolution. The US is discussing this frequently now, and there are a few reasons. The first one is, they believe that we have already issued an internal notice. Secondly, based on some factual evidence, they think that China has made a lot of preparations, particularly in terms of material reserves, which is quite typical of gearing up for a decisive battle. Well, in China, we lack about 20% of the elements on the periodic table. So, they're totally unavailable, right? If so, we need to buy them, which relates to strategic reserves. Now, the CIA found that for nearly all key resources, China's reserves last over 20 years. He said this is basically preparing for a global conflict since commercial reserves last about 6 months, right? Considering that maintaining reserves is very costly, isn't this essentially preparing for a global conflict indeed? Plus, the Americans scrutinize Chinese policies more meticulously than the Chinese themselves, don't they? For example, after we see something like the third plenary session, the Americans analyze it very thoroughly. Hey, did our 20th third plenary session introduce a term we missed? It's called strategic backup, right? All strategic industries must have a backup within the mainland. This is also a preparation for a world war, isn't it? Additionally, of course, there's the procurement of military equipment. What are you buying and which unit are you deploying it to? He can then estimate when you will use it. So putting all these things together, the conclusion is this. What about China? The central government hasn't set a timetable and keeps stressing peaceful reunification, yet the Americans often mention 2027. As a scholar, I agree with the American view and believe the chance for 2027 is quite high. So everyone must be prepared. In 2027, that earth-shaking moment will come. You know, the final battle of the National Liberation War will begin. His issue will surely be settled by force. His military force might be relatively easy, just a blockade. If they block for 2 weeks, he won't have food or drink, so that might be the case, but there might also be a fight. Yes, but it's called a non-peaceful means of resolution. Indeed, it might not necessarily result in a total destruction, but there could potentially be a blockade nevertheless. The likelihood of engaging in combat is quite high indeed. This is why everyone needs to be prepared, the issues need to be resolved, and the use of force might be significant, you know. There shouldn't be any military issues. I estimate that if we engage, we could take Taiwan in a few days, and it's likely the US won't step in. So there shouldn't be any military issues. The potential problems we might face in the future are mainly economic. Our economy is more fragile than Russia's. Russia's economy is very small. Last year, in 2024, Russia's GDP, when calculated at the exchange rate in US dollars, was the same as that of our Jiangsu province. It holds the position of second in China, only surpassed by Guangdong province. We are only 1/10 of that, yet Russia is remarkably strong because of its plentiful resources, including food, oil, natural gas, and minerals. You might not be aware of this, but Russia is the sole nation on the planet that possesses every single element of the periodic table. Just imagine, everyone knows the periodic table was created by Russian Mendeleev, so Chinese netizens speculate he based it on his own country's situation. Otherwise, how can it be that they have 100% of everything? It's not scientific, you know, it's quite mysterious. They really don't lack anything, you know. Our country, on the other hand, lacks food. We import 170 million tons of grain every year, making us the largest grain importer, you know? Japan, the second largest importer, brings in just 40 million tons of grain, while we import over 4 times that, right? We also face oil shortages, don't we? We produce only 200 million tons of oil each year, yet we consume 740 million tons. The gap is 540 million. We are the largest in volume. We import oil, and there's a shortage of natural gas, right? We lack minerals, we lack everything, while it lacks nothing. This is our first weakness. We lack energy. Secondly, we lack a market. As the largest manufacturing country, you have to sell what you produce, right? How can it be okay to end up stuck with it? Russia doesn't lack a market, so why doesn't it have manufacturing, right? Those of you here, think about it. Who among you can still use Russian industrial products, right? Isn't buying Russian products just about honey? Who buys things like big rye bread and kvass? Isn't it a joke for Russia to display their refrigerators? They don't even have refrigerators anymore. Russia used to easily make black and white TVs. He once made color TVs, but withdrew from the market a month later. Why? In 6 months, there were 17 explosions in Russia. They were real explosions, with great explosive power, and with one blast, a whole family was gone. No one survived, you know? Who dare buy it? They quickly left the market after. It really wasn't working, you know? This is the real situation. Russia has no market demand because it lacks resources. Doesn't China need a market, right? This is our weakness, you know? We are 10 times more considerate than Russia, but we lack energy resources. The market's lacking. I see the central government is working hard, all focused on this area. This needs some time right now. I think there's no issue with the military. Even if President Xi orders action today, it would be fine. Militarily, there's no problem. And by 2027, taking action would be even easier. The economy continues to have significant issues, correct? There are challenges on both sides with resources and the market, which is to be anticipated. We need to work hard to solve that. And as for other issues, we might still have political problems, which is us. In the country, many people's interests are tied to Taiwan. And then, even more people's interests are tied to the United States. This is quite troublesome. This is a problem that's not easy for us to discuss. You know, there are hostages over there. There are assets as collateral. Well, the main issues to address regarding Taiwan are likely these two concerns. One is economic and the other is political. There are no issues in the military or diplomatic aspects, you know, but those two are the ones that need to be addressed now. Regardless, the Taiwan issue needs to be resolved. I believe there are no military problems, but there will definitely be a period of economic difficulty afterward, you know, because the sanctions from the West on us will likely be harsher than those on Russia. As I mentioned earlier, we have our vulnerabilities, right? So there will be a period of significant economic difficulty later on. At that time, everyone might need to endure hardships together and face it collectively, right? The central government is also making preparations. Also, some preparations might work, but no matter how ready you are, challenges will always arise. Okay, that's all. But once we get through this hurdle, things will go much more smoothly afterward. Well, I think getting Taiwan back, despite the cost of the reunification, is very worthwhile. From a diplomatic standpoint, if Taiwan is reclaimed, ASEAN countries will definitely align with us. They won't sanction us with the US. Why? ASEAN countries are opportunistic and currently profit economically with us. But for security, they still depend on the US. Yet if Taiwan is reclaimed, they'll see they can't rely on the US for security. Right? We pay you protection money every year, and when danger comes, we're afraid you'll run faster than us. How can we rely on you? Right? I think once negotiations are settled, ASEAN will side with us. If ASEAN sides with us, the South China Sea would be ours, like an internal sea. Then what? Japan and South Korea would likely give in. Everyone's been to Japan and South Korea, right? Today, their living standards are still a bit higher than ours. What about Japan and South Korea? They're really short on resources. I mentioned that mineral earlier. That chemical element is lacking 20%, but Japan is lacking 90%. Right? Japan can really be strangled. It's a basic fact. Living standards in Japan and South Korea are higher than ours, but they lack resources, so they heavily rely on overseas supplies. These supplies depend a lot on maritime transport, right? Japan lacks land routes. South Korea, a peninsula, originally had them, but due to a fallout with its northern neighbor, it doesn't have any now. South Korea is like an artificial island, which is unfortunate. So the conclusion is clear. These two countries rely heavily on overseas resources, which depend a lot on maritime transport, with 85% passing through the South China Sea. Once the South China Sea becomes our inland sea, won't Japan and South Korea's lifeline be under our control? Conclusion, Japan and South Korea will surrender. You are aware, once Japan and South Korea capitulate, the East China Sea will belong to us. Right? So I believe once the Taiwan Strait is settled and the South and East China Seas are secured, then Shanghai will be secured. After that, China will enter its safest period in history. Yes, because in ancient times, our threats were all from the north. So what did we do then? We built the Great Wall. You know, building the Great Wall was very expensive. There was no other way but to build the Great Wall and station troops there, and later on, a lot of soldiers were stationed. It was all very costly. In ancient times, in modern times, well, we succeeded in industrialization, and there was no threat from the north, you know? Nomadism ended in the industrial era, you know. Military enthusiasts are aware that with the advent of machine guns, the role of cavalry in warfare was over. On the plains, 100 machine guns could turn 10,000 cavalry into a heap of flesh. In the agricultural era and cold weapon age, the Mongolians were great, right? They built the Mongol Empire across Europe and Asia, but they couldn't keep up with industrial times, right? With machine guns, the great Mongolians went from warriors to being skilled in song and dance, didn't they? Right? For survival, you know, he had no choice. The northern threat among them disappeared after China's industrialization. Our modern threat is from the sea, the birthplace of Western industrialization. Their industrialization is stronger, so when they came from the sea. In ancient times, threats came from the land. After industrialization, land threats vanished, leaving maritime threats. I think once the Taiwan Strait is settled and Shanghai is secure, those threats will disappear. After it is resolved, China ought to be the safest it has ever been throughout its history. Once it is secure, we can genuinely concentrate on advancing ourselves and enhancing the living standards of the population. This is my forecast concerning the Taiwan matter. Unfortunately, I've run out of time, so I will conclude my presentation at this point, okay? What I mentioned earlier about our weaknesses, the central authorities are addressing them. For example, I believe the energy issue is resolved, so everyone can relax. Regarding food, our main grain reserves now exceed 2 years. No problem at all since China is the top producer, making 700 million tons yearly, and the US follows with 500 million tons. India ranks third with 300 million tons, correct? Russia produces just over 100 million tons, and we're the top producer, logically speaking. We can store for half a year because the Ministry of Agriculture has high reserves. That guy, Lao Xiong, is my friend, and he said half a year is enough, but President Xi insists on more than 2 years. This is because storage is very expensive. China now has a grain storage technology, which is nitrogen storage, using the nitrogen in the air. What are the advantages of nitrogen storage? It preserves freshness, but is inert. So, once the grain is stored, it does not undergo growth, nor does it transform into coal, and after a period of 5 years, it emerges as fresh rice, you understand. But the issue is that it is particularly costly, you know, and this entire process is utilized for that specific purpose. Well, Uncle Chu has already been here for over 2 years now. Additionally, storing grain in the ground, so now many places are reverting forests back to farmland, right? Ma Xinrui is doing well in Xinjiang. It's because he created 7 million acres of arable land in Xinjiang. You know, that's good. This is grain. Everyone can rest assured. As for oil, it seems we can resolve the oil issue by 2027. How do we solve it? First, in the past 14th five-year plan, Based on President Xi's instructions, our Ministry of Land and Resources conducted what should be the most thorough screening of our land since the founding of New China. It has not been announced. However, based on new technology, the investigation results have discovered a lot of oil, gas, and minerals, but this hasn't been announced yet. According to my information, the oil production can increase by 100 million tons. Starting here, the quantity will drop from 200 to 300 million, and then there's the issue of land transport. We initially had 3 pipelines in Central Asia, now complete. The fourth, the ABCD ground line, forms the soil built in Turkmenistan. Plus, a railway was added, the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway. Right? Originally, the railway between China and Europe was just the Trans-Siberian Railway through Russia. Now, Putin has relented. He used to strongly oppose us going into Central Asia, because he considered it their backyard. Due to the Russia-Ukraine war, he agreed, and we seized the chance to set up the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway, finishing by year's end. We added a pipeline and railway in Central Asia, right? On the Russian side, there's a second Siberian line, the western one. Once this is done by 2027, we can boost land oil transport from 100 million tons to 200 million tons. Right? 300 million produced domestically and 200 million overland. That makes 500 million, correct? And now we're promoting those new energy vehicles everywhere, right? We're really enthusiastic about promoting new energy vehicles worldwide, aren't we? They can reduce oil consumption by 100 million tons. You see, this way there's a cut. In the end, there's just a gap of 100 million tons, and that gap isn't a major issue for us. Each time the oil is fine. China's coal-to-oil technology is very mature. It's just expensive, just costly. During wartime, they don't care about that. So basically, I think we've solved the food and energy issues up to now. What we need to focus on next is the market. This isn't resolved well. We still lack a truly unified national market. I don't know if everyone feels this, but many small and medium-sized enterprises along the coast prefer foreign trade. It's not that they love foreign countries, it's because making money abroad is easier. Domestically, when trading across provinces, the institutional barriers are even more than international ones. When you go to each province, you have to renegotiate, the transaction costs are particularly high. What is the actual reason for this? So our nation is politically unified, correct? It's entirely under the leadership of the party, legally unified, isn't it? However, in practice, the administration operates separately. Right? Even after many years since the country's founding, a unified large market hasn't been truly established. Many domestic obstacles hinder a unified market, so internal circulation can't be effective. When it fails, weaknesses arise and reliance on external factors grows. The external market is mostly controlled by the US, right? So from that perspective, China is quite vulnerable. Thus, we need to establish a unified domestic market. To achieve internal circulation, we really need to improve the surrounding Belt and Road Initiative, right? This is something that requires effort and breakthroughs now. Yes, there are obstacles in all directions, including the external Belt and Road Initiative. One issue is security, isn't it? Our current investment problem is that the military hasn't been deployed. This is different from the West. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, didn't the West use a 3-pronged approach, with the military going out first to confront others, right? They would seize the land, then the merchants would divide and support it, and then a group of missionaries would go with a Bible to educate people, saying that if my assistant makes money from you, don't speak ill of me. It's God's will. You see, I'm just carrying out the will, and you have to respect God, right? Just cooperate and everything will be fine. Is this the way the West expanded? Using a 3-pronged approach, while China now is just using capital to expand, isn't it? Doesn't it seem quite pitiful for China? Your military hasn't gone out, nor do you have missionaries, right? So is China now advancing alone? It's quite unfortunate, isn't it? What if there's a war outside, or a civil war? Chinese merchants' assets would just be confiscated, right? There's no protection during wartime. During peacetime, there's no one to defend. Hasn't the Chinese intellectuals focused on one thing for a century? Spreading Western learning to the East, right? They master Western ideas and then boast about them at home to assess professors. What's its role in China's progress? Not sure, but Western learning reached the East. This is the issue facing China. China needs to venture outward, yet it constantly measures itself against the Western world. They approach it from three distinct directions, whereas we advance independently, correct? This situation is quite fragile, and these issues must be resolved. Well, this is my response anyhow. The Taiwan issue remaining outstanding is highly probable. That's what the Americans assert, and I completely concur. Regarding my analysis, there are not many significant problems militarily or diplomatically. The current issues are primarily economic, and secondly, the ones we just discussed that are challenging to explain. We indeed have many wealthy and high-ranking officials in political issues, right? Where are their assets? Where are their children? Where exactly are the hostages being held, correct? Sigh, these individuals possess a significant amount of influence, do they not? Indeed, indeed, indeed. These days, don't many folks often set up family trusts, right? See, domestically, they say I spent less than 50,000 RMB in a year, right? Wearing cloth shoes, yet internationally involved in an 18 billion trust fund. How about that in dollars, right? It's quite startling, and this situation probably isn't rare. It's quite common. How do you handle this, right? Because the main party is still Chinese, and they have significant influence with their interests at stake. How do you deal with that, right? So I think the Taiwan issue, in my opinion, is a significant challenge for the central leadership, especially for Chairman Xi. The difficulty lies in the economy, right? And politics. Military is not an issue. Diplomacy is not an issue. These two problems are quite significant. I don't know how to handle them, but the problems are right here. At Ralph's, you never